everyone to another edition of Dallas Housing Coalition's Housing for All webinar series. My name is Andrea Gillespie and your host of these webinar episodes. I also serve as Senior Manager at Charles Schwab Bank and as a board member of the Dallas Housing Coalition. Thank you again for joining us this morning. On each episode of Housing for All, we discuss whether Dallas is big and if it is truly big enough for everyone by having impactful conversations with members of the Dallas Housing Coalition and community leaders who are Dallas's strongest advocates for keeping the city affordable. Joining us today is actually our first guest ever when we first launched this webinar about almost a year ago, and that is Ashley Flores, Chief of Housing for a local nonprofit organization, Child Action Poverty Lab, or CPAL as it's commonly known. CPAL is an organization committed to cutting child poverty in Dallas by half within 20 years. In her role, Ashley is dedicated to addressing housing's impact on poverty, working to ensure that every family has access to healthy, safe, and affordable housing in stable and thriving communities. Previously, Ashley served as the Director of Planning and Special Projects at the Dallas Independent School District, where she spearheaded innovative school design, personalized learning, and school turnaround initiatives. Ashley holds degrees in business administration and liberal arts from the University of Texas at Austin and in education policy and management from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Ashley, thank you so much for joining us again this morning. It's great to have you back on the show.
It's great to be back. I can't believe it's been almost a year since we
It really has. It really has. I think our very first episode was early November, maybe the first or second Friday of November. I think we've had well over 40 or 50 episodes since then, but you set the tone and we've had great conversations since then.
Great.
Well, let's just jump right in. I'm just wondering, obviously we just talked about a lot has happened in almost a year of doing these Housing for All webinars. And I'm just wondering if you can share any updates or key developments about the work that you're doing at Child Action Poverty Lab.
So since I was last on, I would say the biggest new development is that CPAL, in collaboration with our partners at HRNA Advisors, refreshed the rental housing needs assessment for the city of Dallas with new data. So we had a great response to the report we released last year that we talked about a year ago. And so we committed to updating the data annually so that we could start to see the data over time. And so we have just released our refreshed rental housing needs assessment in the last month. And we use in this year's rental housing needs assessment, we're using 2022 American Community Survey and Bureau of Labor Statistics data, plus more current Zillow, CoStar, and Lightcast data. So we're able to update insights on the gap in the rental housing market, the gaps in particular between supply and demand by household income and size. We also updated the forecast to 2035 and then included some entirely new data insights based on feedback we received last year that I'm excited to talk about.
I love how you took such an impactful report in the 2023 rental needs assessment and kept it alive by updating the data. There's so many times that good research comes out, but it has only such a long shelf life before it either becomes obsolete or the landscape changes. So I'm so glad to hear that your organization is committed to updating and having the latest data available for those who care about housing. And with that, I'm just curious, what are the biggest takeaways from the 2024 rental housing needs assessment compared to the 2023 assessment? And how might this data or the key takeaways inform future housing policies?
It's a great question. And so before we get into findings from the 24 assessment, the assessment we just released, I'm going to have kind of a wonky data moment for a second, but I think it's important to emphasize that it's actually difficult to use the rental housing needs assessment for 1 year comparisons. Instead, I actually recommend reading last year's assessment and then this year's assessment as standalone reports, each representing a snapshot in time of the rental market. I say that because we use a lot of different data to pull together the rental housing needs assessment. But our core data source is the American Community Survey, the 5 year American Community Survey. And in this year's report, that 5 year ACS survey covers 2017 through 2022. In last year's report, the 5 year survey covered 2016 to 2021. So there's actually overlap in the data between the two reports. So it makes it hard to compare them side by side. That said, there are some data sources that are refreshed every year. So there within the report, there are some annual updates, some more direct year over year comparisons. Um, that said, that kind of data wonky framing established, the biggest findings in this year's report, I would say largely track with what we saw in last year's report. First, the greatest need in the rental housing market continues to be affordable units for very low income renter households. The city of Dallas has a gap of around 40,000 rental units affordable to households at or below 50% area median income, which is around $49,000 for a family of four, again, using that 2022 ACS data. We also, again, this year did a forecast, this time to 2035. And in the forecast, we see that the gap between rental housing supply and demand at or below 50% AMI is only projected to grow. We forecast by 2035 that the gap will grow from around 40,000 units today to 76,000 units in 2035 for those households at or below 50% AMI. And that widening gap is really going to be driven primarily by a tremendous anticipated loss of unrestricted affordable housing units. We see in the forecast a loss of potentially 54,000 unrestricted affordable housing units between now and then. We also see in the forecast, this is a bit different from last year, that the gap between supply and demand in the rental market is going to affect not just households at or below 50% AMI, but also households at 60% and 80%, and then all the way up to area median income, 100% area median income, we're seeing gaps. The last thing I'll mention on a sort of big takeaways from this year's report is that even though the region has seen great improvements in educational attainment and also wage growth, the median rent in Dallas is unaffordable for 71% of residents. And 49% of all renters in Dallas, regardless of their income, are housing cost burden. Within the renter population, we see certain groups that are disproportionately affected. For example, 69% of senior renters in this year's data are housing cost burden. Many senior renters are on a fixed income. So as those rent prices escalate, it's hard to keep pace. We also saw that 79% of renter single parents with children are housing cost burden, and 56% of Black renters are housing cost burden. So I'll pause there. I have more insights that we can share, but that's a good maybe place to start.
Yeah, no, wow, there's so much in what you shared. So if I'm understanding you correctly, one of the first issues is that we still don't have enough affordable units for the need. And not only do we not have enough, the gap is widening. And that being said, something else that you brought up, which I'm sure just kind of drives the gap, is that affordable housing essentially is disappearing or falling by the wayside. And am I understanding that first part correctly?
That the gap is most significant for low income households and is growing. Is that
Yes.
yes?
And
Yeah.
that the affordable housing stock that we do have is disappearing.
Yes, specifically naturally occurring affordable housing. So this is another kind of a wonky moment. Naturally occurring affordable housing, or NOAA, as it's often referred to, is housing in the rental market that is affordable without any kind of government subsidy or income restriction. So it's housing in the rental market that for a number of reasons is just affordable to low and moderate income households. For example, maybe it's a fourplex that was built, say, in the 80s and at the time was considered a luxury product, was very expensive. Maybe over time it hasn't had many updates, but has been maintained. Well, over time, then that rental price will filter downward. That's what NOAA is. But NOAA is very vulnerable in a housing market like ours. It's very vulnerable to appreciating home values, also to rising rent prices, and then other costs that get transferred down to the renter, like rising insurance costs, et cetera. And so that NOAA stock is very vulnerable because it doesn't have a protection in place to keep that affordability requirement. So it can be easily, say, scooped up by investors and converted to something else, perhaps.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for unpacking that. That makes so much sense. And the other big point that I heard as you were talking about the key takeaways from the 2024 assessment is that an overwhelming number of renters are house burdened regardless of income.
Right.
I think you said 70%. Is that right?
The 71 the median rent is unaffordable for 71% of residents in Dallas.
That is astronomical. I almost just want to pause there and have our
Yeah.
viewers just take that in.
Yeah,
So,
it's
yeah,
well, just something to like to build on that. I think when one of the new data insights that we added this year in response to questions we got last year is, we reported in last year's report some data on the connection between educational attainment, median wages, and housing affordability, but we did it in a pretty high level way. We got some questions that can you drill down into what that actually means? Can we look at educational attainment and wages compared to rent by different unit types, like a one bedroom versus two bedroom versus three bedroom? So we did that in this year's report. And what we found is that even residents with bachelor's and graduate degrees cannot always afford rent in Dallas. So, as an example, the median Dallas resident with a bachelor's degree earns about $70,000. But even the median resident with a bachelor's degree cannot afford the median rent of a two-bedroom or a three-bedroom rental unit without spending more than 30% of their income on rent. So even those with advanced degrees are finding the rental market tough to navigate if they're looking for larger rental units that are affordable.
no, I mean, thank you again for illuminating that point, because I think it's just so important to drill that home that this is a lot of times when we talk about affordable housing, we look at it just as an issue for very low income earners. And what I hear you saying is this is really an issue that everyone should care about because of just how many households and individuals are rent burdened. And I'm even thinking like those are just renters.
Right.
What about the people who are able to buy a house and you add up all of the stuff that goes into running a house, not just the mortgage, and then I think you even have a bigger housing cost burden issue. And with that, I want to kind of talk now about policy. So, we have this issue of just this stark gap between what we have in affordable housing units and what people need. And then we also have this issue of naturally occurring affordable housing disappearing. Um, with those two issues and some of the other things that you raised, how might we be focusing future policy in terms of housing to address these issues?
So I think, as you alluded to, in the question, because we are at risk of losing so much of our naturally occurring affordable housing stock, I think preservation has to be part of the conversation. How do we maintain our existing stock, our existing inventory of affordable units? And that's true not just for naturally occurring affordable housing, that unsubsidized product in the rental market. It's also true when we look at our subsidized rental units. So when we look at our inventory of rental units that do have a government subsidy that requires an income restriction, we know that there is an expiration date on those properties. They are not affordable in perpetuity. And so in the report, when we look at our subsidized rental stock from 2024 to 2051, there are over 18,000 subsidized rental units within the city of Dallas that are at risk of expiring and losing their affordability status. So when we think about preservation as part of a bigger strategy, it's not just preservation of naturally occurring affordable housing, but also our deed restricted inventory. It's approaching the end of its affordable restriction period.
Mhm. Yeah, and can you talk about more about deed restricted inventory? Like, what do we mean by deed restricted? Because just for our viewers who may not know all the nuances of how we can keep housing affordable.
So an income restricted or deed restricted unit has an income restriction put upon it. So, for example, maybe there's a property where 25% of units rent to households earning at or below 60% of area median income. That's sort of a requirement, is to populate those units with a household at a certain income level. And those units are made affordable by some sort of government program. So, for example, the low income housing tax credit. Locally, we have our Public Facilities Corp. We have other tools in our toolkit that allow us to build and preserve housing that has an income restriction attached to it. And so that's what I mean by deed restricted or income restricted or subsidized housing. It has an income requirement attached to it because of some sort of government program. That's a very general way of describing it, I think.
No, no, I love that. I think that's a perfect way to help people who are new to this conversation understand some of these more nuanced issues or terms. And I'm just curious, looking forward, what do you see as the most critical change that needs to happen to prevent Dallas's housing gap from growing even wider?
I would say just kind of building on this idea of that what we see in the data of the risk, the vulnerability of NOAA. I think that's sort of a data point that in and of itself is sort of a call to action, sort of asks us to think about, well, what should we do? What needs to be in place to preserve those units? What needs to be in place to preserve our deed restricted units as well at risk of expiring? And so when I zoom out, I think what needs to happen is I would really just love to see stakeholders use data to first identify our most acute housing needs that Dallas residents face, and then also to use data to develop and implement a plan to tackle those needs and then track progress and adjust course as necessary over time. Unfortunately, resources are very limited. So we have to use data to carefully consider how to deploy those limited resources in a way that can have the greatest impact. I think related to that, part of this, thinking and planning about where do we go from here is we've got to work together to really carefully balance different priorities. You alluded to this earlier. This assessment that we're talking about today, for example, is just focused on the rental market. And we prioritize the rental market for this report because the majority of Dallas residents, 58%, in fact, are renters. We also know that renters are disproportionately low income and people of color. However, there are other components of the larger housing ecosystem that are also in need of our attention, such as wealth building through home ownership, home repair and preservation. And so we have to take into consideration what data tells us. We also have to think about how do we balance this portfolio of priorities in a way that, again, the greatest impact can be realized.
Mhm. I love that. I really do. And I think that I think part of policy is also what we don't always talk about is the coalition building that needs to
Mm.
happen that helps push policy forward. And I'm just wondering, how do you see stakeholders such as nonprofit organizations, public officials, housing developers, and community leaders collaborate to close the housing gap. In many ways, with the Dallas Housing Coalition, we're fortunate enough to have a lot of those stakeholders already in the fold and working together. But how do you see that kind of coalition building, whether it's through Dallas Housing Coalition or some other entity or alliance collaborating to close the housing gap?
I think for any coalition that exists or that's coming together, it's really important to be anchored in a shared fact base, to have a real collective understanding of the problem as step one. And that's what we were hoping to do with the rental housing needs assessment, was to establish a shared fact base that we all can work from as we're thinking about where to go next. So I think that has to be the first step in any kind of coalition building, is coming together around a shared fact base that includes then really crisp, specific problem statements that we can act upon. That was another kind of part of the impetus for the rental housing needs assessment, was that for a long time we've been talking locally and also nationally about the need for more housing. We hear often, we need more housing, we need more affordable housing, but we hadn't yet locally drilled down to answer questions like, well, exactly how much housing do we need? Affordable to what income levels? What are the unit sizes that we need? Do we need more 1 bedrooms, or do we need more 2 and 3 bedroom rental units? And so that's what we wanted to do in the rental housing needs assessment, was to create that shared understanding of the problem, but then also put forth some really specific problem statements to make that coalition building and then that collective action maybe more focused than sort of just thinking, well, we need more housing. What do we do?
Yeah, I love that. I mean, it's so easy, and the intention is always good and noble to want to jump all the way to solutions. And I've seen this from my past lives as being a lobbyist and way before I came to Schwab Bank and starting my career as a community organizer. Is that you have to really first have a shared understanding of what the problem is, because a lot of people may want the same solution, but that doesn't always mean that they understand what challenges, what drivers, what conditions are driving those need for solutions. And then from there, I think that shared understanding kind of builds the foundation where people can come together, stay together, and then take that leap to what's our overarching vision, and then what are the policies that help us reach that vision.
Yeah.
So I so appreciate you really bringing up just the importance of having a shared understanding of, like, this is the data that we're using, this is the data that makes sense, and
Yeah.
this is the problem that the data is illuminating.
Yeah. Happy to.
Well, great. So, I mean, this goes without saying, but I mean, with each episode, we talk about just all the issues and drivers of the housing affordability crisis in Dallas and honestly in so many other cities and communities. But if we were able to make a real big improvement on, making housing accessible to all who need it, without keeping them in a position of being cost burdened, like what does that mean for families and what they can do in terms of their economic mobility?
Well, when families are housing cost burden, when they're spending a disproportionate share of their income on housing, it usually means that they're making really difficult decisions about trade-offs. So maybe they're paying their rent this month, but they're foregoing preventative health care, or they're cutting back on nutritious food or other educational experiences for their kids. And so when families can access affordable housing, it allows those trade-offs then become more and more minimized, and it allows families to access all of what they need to thrive without that sort of financial worry of, can I make rent this month? And so we know that financial stability is really critical for long-term upward economic mobility. in particular, when we think about kids and how they're impacted by housing affordability and stability. We have another project that is in collaboration with the Dallas Independent School District that's focused on kids who've experienced middle of year moves, who are moving kind of suddenly in the middle of the school year. And what we found in our data is that there's a strong relationship between eviction filing patterns in the neighborhood and then student middle of year moves at the local neighborhood school. And so we see that when housing is unaffordable, in the worst cases, if families are falling behind on rent, they might face eviction, they might have to suddenly move, and maybe they're moving across town, which also means not just a new home, but a new school for their kids, which has a tremendous impact on academic achievement. So there are lots of downstream consequences when housing is unaffordable and families are stretched really thin with their budget.
And I can't help but think of the flip side. Like if families were in a position where they did not have to worry about making rent every month or finding a new place to live because the rent increased way beyond what they can afford, that there's so many other ways that they could be dreaming and supporting their families. And
Yeah.
you know, I mean, I could just think like a parent could go back to school, for instance, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
and you know, kind of try and achieve some career mobility, and you know, could really be present and get involved in their their child's school activities and make parent teacher conferences. And I think the ripple effect from what I'm hearing from you is endless if we're able to address the housing
Yeah.
affordability crisis.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, great. Well, as we round up this conversation, I just wanted to know if there are any future data projects or initiatives on your horizon that our viewers should know about. You mentioned the work you're doing with the Dallas Independent School District and how housing affordability, affects and moves, evictions, things of that nature affects educational attainment. But are there other things that you're working on that you'd like to share in our final minutes today?
Yeah, I would love to. So, actually, speaking of our work with Dallas ISD on housing instability, we just released a new resource. It's called the Secure Housing for Thriving Kids Toolkit, and it's available at securehousingtoolkit.org. And Secure Housing for Thriving Kids is that initiative with school districts to reduce student middle of year moves by identifying families early in need of housing help and connecting them to the right resources. So the toolkit has interventions that we've piloted. It also includes data tools on housing stability and also resources, including some brand new tenant education videos in English and Spanish that we filmed with our friends at the Dallas Eviction Advocacy Center. So definitely check out the toolkit. And then we also plan to release new data briefs and tools on junk fees and the homestead exemption in Dallas soon. So stay tuned. Maybe I can come back and talk about those when they're ready.
You know, we have an open door policy here, so whenever you're ready to share, we're ready to have you.
Great, great.
Well, thank you, Ashley, so much. It's always so wonderful to talk to you. I learn so much whenever we are able to connect. And just thank you again this morning for sharing just all your data insights and research that you are working on to illuminate the affordable housing crisis and hopefully point us towards solutions. So thank you.
Thanks again for having me.
Great. Well, before we sign off today, I just want to encourage all of our viewers to follow the Dallas Housing Coalition on all its social media channels for updates on how to get involved in the work of the coalition and stay connected to our Housing for All webinar series. And while you're at it, please visit the Dallas Housing Coalition website, which is dallashousingcoalition.com, to learn more about our member organizations like CPAL. And you can also join the coalition from the website if you're not already a member. Finally, I'm really excited to announce that Dallas Housing Coalition is hosting its inaugural Housing Summit on Thursday, November 21st from 11:30 a.m. to 8 p.m. at the Bill J. Priest Center in Dallas. You can buy tickets from the Dallas Housing Coalition website to attend. Again, the Dallas Housing Coalition website address is dallashousingcoalition.com. We'd love to have you. There's going to be great panels, lots of good discussion. So please visit the website and buy your tickets soon. And with that, thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of the Housing for All webinar series, where we discuss whether Dallas is big and if it is truly big enough for everyone. Have a wonderful week.